Hey, welcome to Socialism for All. This file is being recorded for the July 2021 edition of Socialism for All. And this is an audiobook and discussion of Richard Pankhurst's Racism in the Service of Fascism, Empire Building and War, the history of the Italian fascist magazine, La Difesa della Razza. If you like this video, please click like and subscribe, and consider supporting us on Patreon. There's a link to Patreon in the video description. So, this was written in 2007, first published by Stefan Brunner and Heinrich Scholler in Auf dem Weg zum modernen Äthiopien, Festschrift for Bayreuth Tafel, Münster 2005, HTML by Mike B. for Marxist's Internet Archive, March to April 2007, copyright Richard Pankhurst, published by Marxists.org by permission of the author, and thanks as usual to the Marxists Internet Archive at Marxists.org. They host thousands of free Marxist texts. Please go check them out and support them if you can. So let's get into the text. Introduction. Italian colonialism, like virtually all modern European colonialism, was from its inception inherently, at least partially, racist. Italy's, quote, firstborn colony, Eritrea, Bayreuth Tafel's homeland, was thus characterized from the outset by considerable racial discrimination. Italian and, quote, native housing in Asmara and other Eritrean towns thus tended to be separate. The principle of different schools for Italians and, quote, natives in the colony was officially decreed as early as 1909, and urban segregation in Asmara in 1916. No less significant was the institution of Madamismo, by which Italian officials, soldiers, and others took native wives, concubines, and mistresses who had virtually no rights at law. Italian fascism, which was largely parochial and Italy-centered, was at first entirely oblivious to questions of race and did not envisage any specifically fascist racial policy. At the time of the invasion of Ethiopia in 1935, the fascists permitted the sale of semi-pornographic pictures of Ethiopian women to popularize their African adventure among the Italian troops. The Italian authorities also gave publicity to the song Facetta Nera, in which the Piccola Abyssina, or young Ethiopian girl, was supposedly to be, quote, liberated by them. The British Marxist biologist, Professor J.B.S. Haldane, hearing of Mussolini's plan to settle 250,000 Italians in Ethiopia, wrote to the London Times a fortnight after the fascist occupation of Addis Ababa on 5 May 1936 to predict that the invaders would, quote, interbreed with the Ethiopians and thus lead to, quote, a considerable influx of African blood into Italy. This prediction was immediately falsified by events. On the very day that the Times published Haldane's prediction, the fascist newspaper Gazzetta del Popolo carried an article entitled, "The Fascist Empire Cannot Be an Empire of Half-Castes." Fascist propaganda was thereupon launched against the Facetta Nera song. Less than a year later, the first of a series of Italian racist decrees prohibiting conjugal relations between Italian citizens and colonial subjects of the Italian East African Empire, was signed by the King Emperor Vittorio Emanuele III on 19 April 1937. This edict, which may be said to represent the beginning of official Italian racism, was followed by a succession of further royal decrees strengthening racist practices, as well as by a series of orders by fascist administrators in East Africa, establishing segregation in almost all fields of life. This was a period when Mussolini's relations with Nazi Germany were drawing rapidly and inexorably closer. The ties linking the two dictatorships found dual expression in the Duce's visit to Germany from October 22nd to 24th, 1937, and in the Führer's return visit to Rome from 3 to 9 May 1938. Scarcely more than 2 months after this later visit, the fascist government, on the 14th of July, published its notorious Manifesto della Razza, which is believed to have been personally conceived by the Duce. 3 weeks afterwards, on 5 August, there appeared an expensively produced 44-page racist fortnightly periodical, La Difesa della Razza. Printed in photogravure, it was edited by the fascist journalist Telioso Interlandi. Selected for the post by Mussolini personally, he was a veteran fascist luminary who had founded the fascist newspaper Il Tibere, i.e. the Tiber, in 1924. Soon to emerge as a notorious protagonist of racism, he shortly afterwards wrote a polemical book entitled Contra Judeos, or Against the Jews, which appeared in a series of writings entitled Biblioteca Razziale Italiana, i.e. Italian Racial Library. La Difesa, which, according to a later critic, was designed, quote, to give an appearance of seriousness and, quote, a scientific veneer to Mussolini's new racist theses, sold for 1 lira and was well funded. It claimed a circulation for the first 4 issues of between 130,000 and 150,000 copies, and carried advertisements from 3 of Fascist Italy's leading banks, the Banca Commerciale Italiana, the Credito Italiano, and the Banco di Sicilia, 2 insurance companies, the Riunione Adriatica di Sicurezza and the Istituto Nazionale dell'Assicurazione, and 2 industrial firms, the Società Ebreda and the Officine Bilar Perosa. Comment, my apologies, I do not speak much Italian, so I'm not sure if those pronunciations were on the mark. Continuing. The publication's editorial board, in addition to Interlandi, included 3 staff members of the Università di Roma, Professor Guidi Landra, an anthropologist, Dr. Marcello Ricci, a zoologist, and Dr. Lino Bucinco, a pathologist, as well as Professor Lidio Cipriani, the best known of the group, who was director of the Museo Nazionale di Antropologia e di Etnologia of Firenze. They were later joined for the 3rd issue by Dr. Leone Franzi, a pediatrician at the Università di Milano. All 6 contributed frequently to the publication. The editorial secretary was Giorgio Almirante. The first issue, which appeared on 5 August 1938, and the 2 following, bore a dramatic cover illustration. It depicted the head of a Roman statue, which the editors evidently considered the highest expression of humanity, separated by an iron sword from a hook-nosed 3rd century AD caricature of a Jew, and a photograph of a bead-bedecked, shining Ethiopian African girl of Negroid appearance. This composite picture, which typified the virulently racist character of the periodical, became its official emblem and was reproduced on the inner title pages of many later issues. Immediately after the appearance of the first issue, Interlandi was given an audience by Mussolini. At this meeting, which took place sometime between 5 and 7 August, the Duce reportedly expressed considerable satisfaction with the publication and gave directions for its future development. The publication, though highly prejudiced and strongly xenophobic, was throughout its existence beautifully printed. It contained many fine pictures of Roman statues and classical Italian paintings, intended to display the greatness of Italy's cultural heritage and to contrast it with the assumed primitive character of African and other cultures, as well as the, quote, decadence of fascist Italy's European and American enemies. The periodical may well have attracted many readers by such photographs as much as by its racism. Beautiful pictures were thus used in the service of squalid propaganda, which, it may be noted, preceded by a decade the official development of apartheid in South Africa. The following paper attempts to trace the history and analyze the ideological and propagandist stance of the magazine, consistently racist and bitterly opposed to miscegenation, comment that is interracial marriage, as well as anti-Semitic. It also reflected the day-to-day requirements of the regime and was therefore at various times anti-African, anti-French, anti-Anglo-Saxon, i.e. anti-British and anti-American, anti-Bolshevik, and anti-Slav. La Difesa, which constituted a remarkable chronicle of Italian and fascist racism and xenophobia, continued to appear throughout the latter years of the occupation of Ethiopia, where it was widely distributed in official circles. The publication ceased to appear only on the eve of the Allied landings in Italy and the resultant fall of fascism in that country. The racist ideas embodied in this publication were important in that they influenced and reflected Italian government policy and thinking throughout the occupation of Ethiopia. This was particularly the case in relation to urban segregation, discriminatory education and health policies, and above all, attitudes to miscegenation and, quote, half-castes. The first issue. The first issue of La Difesa set the tone for later issues. It opened with a statement on razzismo italiano, or Italian racism. This was supposedly formulated by a group of fascist university teachers under the aegis of the Fascist Ministry of Popular Culture. Mussolini's son-in-law, Galeazzo Ciano, however, confided to his diary that the Duce had told him that, quote, in fact, he had drafted almost the whole thing himself. The statement laid down the following 10 main theses, to which the periodical often returned in later issues. 1. Different human races exist. 2. There exist great and small races. 3. The concept of race is an entirely biological concept. 4. The population of present-day Italy is of Aryan origin, and its civilization is Aryan. 3. The belief that the Italian race was significantly modified by immigration in historic times is a myth. 6. There now exists a pure, quote, Italian race. 7. It is time that Italians should proclaim themselves avowedly racist. 8. It is necessary to make a clear distinction between the Mediterranean races of Western Europe on the one side and the Orientals and Africans on the other. 9. Hebrews do not belong to the Italian race. And 10. The purely European physical and psychological characteristics of the Italian race must in no way be changed. The statement thus summarized was endorsed by the periodical's editorial. In it, Interlandi claimed in pompous vein that the publication had appeared at the, quote, right moment because, quote, the first phase of racial polemics is closed, science has pronounced, the regime has proclaimed the urgency of the problem. It is fitting to call to Italians not only in terms of a doctrine which has now received its simplest and most efficacious formulation, but also for its irrevocable necessity and its vast range. With her conquest of the empire, with her resultant assumption of ever greater historical responsibilities, Italy must give the racial problem the prominence due to it, both from the strictly biological point of view and from that of custom, unquote. The article concluded by defining the publication's intended scope as a threefold one of, quote, science, documentation, and polemics, unquote. In accordance with this policy, the first issue of La Difesa published Nazi German statistics which purported to show that Jews statistically exceeded non-Jews in such crimes as, quote, usury or dishonesty in credit, bankruptcy, fraud, diffusion of obscene literature, outrages against decency, blackmail, absenteeism in respect of military duties, violation of obligations derived from judicial decisions, falsification of documents, insults, and slander, unquote. Comment, reminds me of how Breitbart, Nazi news site, had a special section dedicated to black crime. That, of course, was headed for a while by Ben Shapiro. Continuing. The above was followed by a number of pseudo-scholarly and highly polemical articles, for the most part extensively illustrated, designed to popularize the concept of race and the superiority of that of Italy. They carried such self-explicatory titles as, quote, biological heredity and racism, quote, the ethnic unity of the Italian race and history, quote, the characteristics of Romanity, quote, Youth and the Italian Race. Another essay inquired whether, quote, racism could exist in medicine, and answered by citing Mussolini, as might be expected, in the affirmative. A further article, entitled, quote, Mongrels, or Persons of Mixed Race, was illustrated with numerous photographs designed to prove the assumed depravity of, quote, half-castes. Two other characteristic articles may be mentioned. The first, on, quote, the bourgeoisie, or middle class, and race, unquote, sought to demonstrate that the Italian middle class had lost its, quote, sense of the nation, while the, quote, cosmopolitan bourgeoisie was, quote, dominated by the Hebrews, or Jews. The objective of fascism, the author argued, was therefore to separate, quote, the Hebrews from, quote, the Italian nation, and to consider Jews as, quote, strangers both, quote, in blood and culture. The other article, on the, quote, control of the Hebrew cultural movement in Germany, unquote, was no less significant. It praised and committed itself to support the Nazi attitude towards the Jews. Nazi Germany, it made quite clear, was thereafter to be the model for Fascist Italy's approach to race. The next four issues. The next four issues, which constituted Volume 1 of La Difesa, followed and developed the lines already established, copiously illustrated with photographs selected for their propaganda impact. They contained polemical articles on the following 6 themes. First theme, the assumed importance of racism, as reflected in biographical differences between different races. These differences were propounded in articles with such self-explanatory titles as, quote, Antiquity of Racial Differences, and, quote, Blood and Race, both in issue number 3. Quote, Types of Hair in the Human Race, issue number 2. Quote, The Biological Blood Individuality of Races, issue 5. And, quote, Mendelism in Man, number 3. Several articles also touched on eugenic considerations and discrepancies between the birth rate of different social classes, as argued, for example, in, quote, Heredity and Eugenics, issue number 5, and, quote, A Danger for the Race, The Decadence of the Upper Classes, issue number 2. Comment, I'm just adding quotes here to set off the titles of the article, just for clarity. Normally I wouldn't be reading quote around an article title. I'm just doing that to set it off as the title for the sake of clarity in these lists here. Continuing. Topic number 2, the supposed physical virtues and Aryan character of the, quote, Italian race. These themes were propounded in such articles as Concepts of Italian Racism and, quote, The Italian Race Has Always Been Distinct from Other Races, issue 2, quote, Physical Characteristics of the Italian Race, issue 3, and to rebut any idea that Italians might be of mixed race, quote, Blondes and Brunettes of the Italian Race, from issue 4. Topic 3, the evil character and racial inferiority of the Jews, and the threat to civilization which they posed. Comment, this whole question of threats to civilization, we know that the actual threat to stability of human existence is capitalism. It is a system which introduces inequality and instability and war wherever it goes. However, the fundamental purpose of fascism is when the ruling class of capitalism is feeling threatened by the possibility, the very close possibility in the case of Italy, of revolution, they introduce this deeply, wildly reactionary system of ideology, fascism, which basically, you could almost say, has it takes some of the revolutionary energy and tone of, say, a communist socialist movement, but then changes it around, changes class war into race war, and makes the whole thing in defense of the status quo. Basically, you could say that they are defending capitalism with almost revolutionary zeal. All right, continuing. These assertions were developed in The Hebrews as a Race in issue number 3 and The Distribution of the Hebrews in the Five Continents, which claimed that there were 52,000 Jews in Italy, with the implication that this was that number too many in issue number 5. One article in issue number 3 attacked the allegedly Jewish character of Marx's materialism. Another, in issue number 4, entitled The Three Instruments of International Jewry, argued that the Jewish threat to civilization was threefold. It supposedly came from high finance, represented by the millionaire Lord Rothschild, terrorism by the Hungarian communist Bela Kun, and pseudo-democracy by the 19th century British politician Benjamin Disraeli. Topic 4. Differences between, quote, whites and, quote, blacks, and the latter's presumed racial inferiority. Such contentions were propounded in polemical articles with such pseudoscientific titles as Racial Differences Between Whites and Blacks in the Third Month of Embryonic Life, from issue 2, and The Metrical Scale of Intelligence and the Mental Inferiority of Negroes, from issue number 5. Topic 5. Racism in Italy and the Italian colonies, propounding the supposed degeneracy of, quote, half-castes, as well as the need to keep the Italian and, quote, native races entirely separate. These arguments were formulated in an article called Colonial Racism in issue number 2, Racism and Colonial Possessions, issue 3, and even more explicitly in the Prestige of the Race Lies the Safeguard of the Empire, okay, from issue number 5. The periodical also attacked the existence of, quote, half-castes in an essay entitled Half-Casteism, Danger to the Moral and Physical Health of Peoples, issue number 4. It was accompanied by such slogans as, quote, mongrels often display degenerate physical characteristics, quote, unions between different races are more dangerous than between the same race, and, in even stronger language, in half-casteism is synonymous with depravity and degeneration, unquote. Topic 6. The supposed special role of Italian women in preserving the Italian race in the empire. Comment here. We wonder sometimes how white supremacy is maintained so strongly in the United States. White women play a huge role in that. We'll see what they have to say about how Italian fascists did it, and then maybe I'll supplement with a few comments on how it's done in the United States. Continuing, this thesis was developed in an article called Woman, Guardian of the Character of the Race, from issue number 4, which claimed that, quote, only Italian colonization, different from that of the French and British, is based on demographic principles. It is therefore on woman that the future of our colonies greatly depends. The woman who in Africa forgets the dignity of the race and grants excessive familiarities to the blacks compromises the future of Italian colonization. Unquote. Comment, oh no. This thesis, which was by then official Italian fascist policy in Africa, was symbolized by a photograph, to present-day eyes entirely absurd, of a European woman, elegantly dressed in a long skirt and hat, holding an umbrella and standing erect, formally shaking hands at a distance of over a meter with a completely naked black man. Some other articles, such as Internationalism and Racism, issue 2, praised the racial policies of Nazi Germany and Fascist Italy, while others again, such as The Jewish Shadow over France, issue 3, condemned supposed Jewish influence in that country and its alleged resultant degeneracy. An anti-French approach, symbolic of then-fascist foreign policy, was likewise apparent in a piece entitled Italians and French, Two Races, Two Civilizations, in issue number 5. Despite the magazine's almost pathological xenophobia, it should be noted that, doubtless because of Mussolini's claim to be protector of Islam, nothing was said against Muslims. On the contrary, an article in issue 2 argued the latter, though theoretically anti-racist, were, because of their attachment to Islam, unlikely to produce interracial unions with Italians. There was therefore little apparent danger, it was believed, of Italo-Muslim, quote, half-castes. Comment. Okay, so they didn't go into a super amount of detail there. We'll maybe do this in a video to come later on white supremacy and far-right extremist movements in the United States, but white women play a huge role in that. Part of the way that this is done is by ideology that tells white women that the white supremacist system puts them on a pedestal. Basically, that they need to be defended from all the non-white, quote, savages or whatever they're going to call them, and that basically the white women need this system to protect them, and in exchange, it will give those white women an elevated status. Many white women over history, up to today and including today, have bought into this for that status. Capitalists are always looking for ways that they can cheaply, with as little effort, investment, and change as possible, buy off and gain the consent of poor, oppressed, and working people who by far would be better off by abolishing that system. They are always looking to gain the consent of these people as cheaply as possible, whether it's naming a street after one of your heroes, whatever, as long as it doesn't result in change, as long as it doesn't really cost them money or power, particularly power. I mean, they don't want to spend money, but they're happy to spend money some amount of money in pursuit of hanging on to power. You see that, for example, in anti-union campaigns, where the capitalist, the employer, will spend far more than the employees were asking for in benefits just to keep the union out. So in the case of giving, white women, for example, or really white workers in general, who'd be better off without capitalism, they will give them this elevated status and they'll say, well, hey, at least we don't treat you like we treat the black workers or native workers or whatever. You get that special, 1% extra crumb, and suddenly you've got these people supporting your system, at least not trying to tear it down, distracted and divided. So there you go. Continuing. The Declaration of the Fascist Grand Council of 6 October 1938. The fascists lurch to racism, for which La Difesa della Razza had been established, found expression in a much publicized meeting at the beginning of October 1938 of the Fascist Grand Council, the Gran Consiglio del Fascismo. Its member, after some deliberation masterminded by Mussolini, issued a virulently racist declaration on 6 October, which was dutifully reproduced on the opening page of the magazine's issue for 20 October. It stated that, quote, fascism for 16 years has developed and formulated a positive attitude directed to the quantitative and qualitative amelioration of the Italian race, an amelioration which could be gravely compromised with incalculable political consequences by interbreeding and Mongolism, unquote. The declaration further proclaimed, quote, the prohibition of the marriage of Italian men and women with, quote, elements belonging to the Hamitic, Semitic, and other non-Aryan races, the prohibition of the marriage of state employees and employees of state organizations, civil and military, with foreign women of any race, unquote. The Council also affirmed the need to reinforce measures against, quote, threats to the prestige of the race in the territories of the empire, unquote. The Council asserted that world Jewry, especially after the abolition of Freemasonry, was, quote, the animator of anti-fascism in all camps, unquote, and declared that, quote, foreign Hebrewism and Italian exiles abroad had in certain periods, notably in the early days of fascism in 1924 and 25, and during the Ethiopian War, had been, quote, unanimously hostile to fascism, unquote. Jews, the declaration stated, were therefore to be excluded from most fields of state employment, including the army and the universities. The subsequent issue of La Difesa, dated 20 October 1938, attempted to publicize, justify, and popularize the Council's declaration. Its statement that fascism had worked for 16 years for the Italian race thus evoked sycophantic and profusely illustrated articles on the, quote, fascist guardianship of the race, as well as, more generally, on the, quote, purity and unity of blood of the Italian race, and its, quote, homogeneity. The Council's remarks on Jewish antagonism to fascism resulted in polemical articles with such titles as Hebrewism and Fascism, The Jews Against Italy in the Period of Sanctions, and Bolshevism of Hebrew Type. The latter was illustrated by a photograph of the Russian revolutionary Leon Trotsky framed in a Star of David. There was also a map and statistical tables showing the diffusion of Jews throughout Italy, and a cartoon of a Jew sitting grotesquely on a building labeled Parliament. The Council's prohibition on Jews entering military and state service was supported by articles entitled Hebrew Defeatism and How the Jews Plundered Germany During the Great War, as well as The Hebrew Does Not Assimilate and Our Art and Hebrew Deformation. The Council's ban on interracial marriage likewise led to a further spate of racist articles, illustrated with photographs of miserable-looking, and in many cases actually deformed, half-castes. These articles bore such evocative titles as Interbreeding with Africans is an outrage against European civilization, and, on half-castes, Let us prevent the birth of the unfortunates. The second year, 1938 to 1939. La Difesa della Razza's second year, which witnessed the outbreak of the European War, ran from 5 November 1938 to 20 October 1939. Now expanded to 56 pages, and at times even to 64, the publication carried many articles with page-sized photographs or other illustrations. Articles were not too dissimilar in theme from those of the previous year, but there were many striking, and for the most part, virulently racist, new cover illustrations. That for issue number 8, for example, depicted a strong-armed Italian crushing in his clenched fist a multi-headed serpent in the shape of a Star of David. Another cover, for issue number 11, showed a semi-naked European woman being accosted by a leering, hook-nosed Jew, and an ugly and supposedly insensitive African. A third cover, for issue number 12, was illustrated by a tree, one side of which, tended by a hard-working Italian, bore fruit, while the other, beside a skeleton representing France, or the, quote, democracies in general, was entirely barren. The picture's demographic implication was underlined by a quotation from Mussolini, who had declared, quote, strong people are fertile people, the weak, vice versa, are sterile, unquote. Quick comment, I just want to say something about the fascist attacks on, quote, democratic France and other capitalist democracies. Of course, we communists are no friends of bourgeois capitalist democracy in and of itself. It is a farce. It is really democracy primarily for the rich. I mean, whatever civil liberties you can get out of the deal, so be it. But, again, communists do not hold up bourgeois democracy as a good example. However, the emergence of fascism, as we have documented in other videos on fascism on this channel, fascism is a response by the ruling class to when their system comes under threat, particularly when there is a revolutionary moment which is not fully seized by the working class. So it's more than just a failed revolution, in which case you might get a punitive right-wing regime afterwards. In the case of Italy, there basically, after World War I, there were widespread factory occupations, and they had a revolutionary moment. They could have seized power, but it was argued that the socialist leadership was kind of too spineless and lacking vision to, lead the working class to fully go through with that. Otherwise, we might have seen a socialist revolution in Italy at that time, really shortly after the Russian Revolution. So you get fascism as a response. If you want more details, look at some of the Claret Zetkin audiobooks on this. Also, there is, before he really turned to shit, a Bordiga audiobook reporting on fascism from using intelligence from people who watched it come to pass, watched the rise of fascism in Italy. And one of the hallmarks of this is that in order to both defend the status quo and prevent revolution, but also, take some of that existing revolutionary sentiment and channel it towards something else, the fascists tended to have a seemingly revolutionary platform, at least in some ways. I mean, minus class struggle, but they would have these strongly worded, like I said, they would kind of usurp some of this revolutionary rhetoric, although they would put it in defense of the status quo. They would basically accuse the capitalist democracies of being weak and, feckless and prone to revolution, and, that they would basically harbor all of these, quote, degenerate elements and all this other kind of nonsense. So it was basically just harder-edged capitalist rhetoric, when you really boil it down, that actually was coming out of terror that there was going to be a socialist revolution. So even to this day, you get fucking morons who buy into fascism, like actual Mussolini fascism, as some kind of like legitimate way that is neither capitalism nor socialism. These people are fucking dupes. Any clear-headed analysis of the, roughly 20 years of fascism in Italy shows it was nothing special. It was just a bunch of empty promises and a perpetuation of the status quo. There was nothing significantly different about the fascist countries from the, quote, democracies that they were, by which I mean bourgeois capitalist democracies, which they claimed some superiority to. All it was taking a system exactly like France or something like that and reining in the civil liberties. That's, pretty much all it amounts to. It's capitalists resorting to any means necessary to avoid socialist revolution. All right, continuing. With the approach of the European War, the magazine adopted an increasingly militaristic line. This was symbolized by an article entitled Total War and Consciousness of Race in issue 15. Other contributions sought to emphasize the vaunted warlike qualities of the, quote, Italian race on the one hand, and the decadence and, quote, Jewish domination of fascist Italy's anticipated enemies, France, Britain, and the, quote, democracies in general. Increasing attention was also paid to the alleged achievements and aspirations of Nazi Germany, and to defects, weaknesses, and Jewish influence of the British and French. Through glorifying fascist colonialism and racism, the magazine saw no contradiction in painting a highly critical picture of the colonial and racist policies of the European, quote, democracies. Commenting on that, I didn't comment on it at the time, but there was that note above in this article about how Italian fascists claimed that their colonialism was superior to France's. I'm sorry, when you're trying to split that kind of hairs to make your fascism look better, it's totally laughable. It's totally absurd. But, this is the low level of critical thinking about social issues that very conservative people have. I think of libertarians and other conservatives in the United States. They just can't think critically about social issues. Anyway, that's why we're here, to try to raise the general level of the discourse, the education, to help people to think critically and arrive at Marxist solutions. Some people, I wonder if they can be helped. Continuing. With the outbreak of the European conflagration, La Difesa devoted increasing space to military photographs. Effort was also made to persuade readers by text and illustration that fascist Italy's interests and ideology were identical to those of Nazi Germany. The magazine also displayed interest in the Italian occupation of Albania, as well as in the existence of other European fascist regimes, notably in Hungary and Romania. Immediately before and in the first months of the European War. La Difesa was mainly preoccupied with the following 10 themes. Theme 1. The supposed urgent need to intensify Italian racial consciousness. This was expressed in an article entitled Cultivating Racial Pride During Infancy, Issue 7. The racial theme was also developed in numerous other pieces, such as Racism and Civilization in Issue 10, Blood Groups, The Need for a Census of Blood in Issue 5, Heredity and Blood in Issue 8, and Racial Eugenics and Mixed Marriage in Issue number 11. Racism was likewise expounded and prominence given in the issue of 20 March 1939 to the news that the Italian Council of Ministers had approved draft laws providing penal sanctions for the defense of the Italian race in relation to the natives of Italian Africa, issue number 10. The text of this law was subsequently published in the issue for 20th of June, issue number 16. Seeking to justify this escalation of racist legislation, an article entitled Half-Casteism, Death of Empires, issue number 13, dwelt on the alleged evils of racial miscegenation. This was accompanied by a racist bibliography with entries from the 19th century French author, and then there's a typo here, so I'm not sure who the author is, to Mussolini and Adolf Hitler's Mein Kampf. Theme 2. The presumed superiority and martial character of the, quote, Italian race. This found expression in chauvinistic articles on the, quote, military virtue of the Italian race, issue 1, and hierarchy of races and Italian preeminence, number 10, as well as, on a somewhat different theme, the beauty of the Italian race, issue number 17. The supposed homogeneous character of that race was also expounded in pseudoscientific terms in Physical Attributes of the Italian Race, which contain data on Italian eyes and hair, in issue 11. Such racist theses were also supported by pseudo-historical articles on the Garrison family of Romanity, issue 4, and the unity of the Italian race from the Etruscans to the Renaissance, issue 5. An article entitled Physical Type and Moral Character of True and False Italians, issue 14, presented photographic caricatures designed to distinguish between true or Aryan Italians and the false ones, the Jews. Topic number 3. The worldwide diffusion of Italians, not a few of them in Italy and its empire, who, it was implied, stood unanimously behind the Duce. Praise was at the same time lavished on Italian empire building. This theme was expounded in such articles as Italians came from the mountains and across the seas to conquer a fatherland, an empire, issue number 3, and the colonial policy of Fascist Italy, issue 13. Topic number 4. The alleged inherent cowardice of the, quote, Jewish race, which, it was suggested, justified its rigid exclusion from the Italian armed forces. This was asserted, for example, in a series of polemical articles in issue number 1, in which Jews were described as, quote, a people without heroes, a, quote, race of defeatists, and, quote, a people without armies. A fourth article was no less emphatically entitled, quote, Jew and Soldier, an antithesis. Comment there. So we hear all of these desperate appeals to militarism through racism. Look at the United States right now. Look at virtually every movie that comes out is some kind of glorification of war, whether it's in a fantasy guise like a superhero movie, or whether it's just a more overt, war military story. It's everywhere in a way that just was less common in, let's say, the 90s. I mean, before the start of the War on Terror. It wasn't popular, especially after the war in Vietnam, the U.S. imperialist invasion of Vietnam. The U.S. really had to cool it for a long time, and militarism got consigned just to very conservative circles. It's been in our faces in a way that it's just hard to describe how saturated U.S. media is with militarism and heroes and this idea of just, this sort of like violent action and bravery and heroism, warriors, whether it's like the Viking shows or whatever it takes so many forms. But it just wasn't popular before the war on terror and the ruling class's need to, convince the public that, hey, war is a super good idea, that, oh, don't worry about it collapsing your standard of living. And I mean, you look at the fucking free fall we're in. The social fabric of the United States is torn to shreds. And a large part of that is we've been at war for fucking 2 decades. And you read stories about the people who just keep getting sent back again and again and again into different combat situations. This is doing nothing but propping up corporate empires. Nothing. It doesn't help anyone's safety. And then what happens to all these people after they're done with their military service, if they can get out of it without being killed or, massively injured to where, they're just traumatized for the rest of their lives? Well, the more functional ones, some of them become cops. Then we get more militarized police forces. It's just a sinking down into hell of the entire society which engages in this stuff. And we see what happened to Italy. They lasted about 20 years of fascism, and then they got destroyed in World War II. And then, there was a more left-wing, partially left-wing rebuilding. But, of course, the U.S.-backed Imperial Intelligence Services, the OSS, NATO, CIA, prevented revolution. That's another story, Operation Gladio. Anyway, but militarism, racism, glorification of war, heroism, this leads to one place, and it's not good. All right, continuing. Topic number 5, the supposed crimes of the Jews, whom the magazine attacked on innumerable counts. These went back to rebelling against ancient Rome, as related in Revolts and Seditions of Jews in the Roman Empire, issue 10. I just have to comment there. That's great. So you have articles about, the bad behavior of Jews going back 2,000 years to the Roman Empire. And, they've just been these eternal enemies of the, quote, Italian race. It's just, it's desperate, obviously. But the sad thing is that it works, and that's my point. They wouldn't run articles like this if they didn't work on at least some people. And, I guess that's just the human condition. Some of us see through stuff like that more easily than others, but we definitely need to counter this propaganda and shut it down, whenever it pops up in a new form. All right, continuing. They were also accused of being interested only in money, of being opposed to religion, in Irreligion of Middle-Class Judaism, in issue number 22, of having a criminal disposition, in Criminal Hebrew Psychology, issue number 18. I laugh, by the way, because it's just like, who believes this shit? Somebody did. Continuing. Practicing diabolical rites, including the killing of children, in an article called Hebrew Rights, issue 22. Lusting after Christian women, in How the Jews Consider Women Non-Hebrew, issue 14. Being involved in an international Bolshevik conspiracy, in The International Jews, which was copiously illustrated with Nazi German cartoons, issue 20. Working against Christian values, in How the Jews Try to Annex the Patrimony of the Church, issue 5. And The Jews Against Rome, issue number 19. Betraying Italy at the conclusion of the World War, in The Hebrew Peace Betrayed the Victory, issue 1. Exerting excessive worldwide influence to the detriment of Italy, in The Hebrew International and Italy, issue number 2. Of being antisocial, in The Jews Against Social Justice, which listed such allegedly Jewish aspects of life as stock trading and usury and oligarchy of money. And finally, being a source of corruption, particularly in France, in Hebrews in Paris, issue number 2. Two quick comments there. Nothing wrong with being against religion. We should be against religion. It is one of the most fucking useless backdoors to reactionary thought of all kind. It is not a friend of humanity, and we need to abolish and move on from religion as soon as is humanly possible. Second of all, you got to love it when fascists rally for social justice. But again, this is some of that usurping of radical rhetoric and energy towards status quo interests. What about Marx? Marx was from a Jewish background. I'm pretty sure he was against stock trading and usury and the oligarchy of money. But again, this would try to look for some coherence or some integrity to deplorable fascist ideology. There is none. Fascist ideology is the desperate outcry of a capitalist class doing whatever it can, poisoning the minds of the masses to try to hang on to its own power over the masses. Continuing. Though many such articles dwelt on the alleged inferiority of the Jews, others, notably in issue number 17, complained of the prominent position they had acquired in many fields, including literature, poetry, art, science, journalism, cinema, banking, law, and finance. Other articles, notably in issues 19, 20, and 22, included highly critical sketches of the Jewish presence in such countries as Poland, Romania, Spain, North Africa, and in the case of the Falashas, Ethiopia. So, quick comment here, that's the end of topic number 5, just to draw a little bit more clearly a picture of what the fascists are doing. Now, these are some of the same issues that, having nothing to do with Jews, but they mention some of the same issues that socialists are against. Like I mentioned, stock trading, usury, the oligarchy of money. But what they're trying to do is to move away from a systemic critique, a critique of the system, of property rights, etc. And they're trying to punch down with a conspiracy that racializes the problem rather than explaining it in materialist terms of the interests, the material interests, as enshrined in property rights and property relations of a system that needs to change. They try to just make it about these, in this case, Jewish underminers of civilization. That, in other words, the system is fine, but it's somehow these immoral people or this immoral group of people who are enemies of our culture and, therefore are trying to bring down our otherwise perfectly fine system, which doesn't need to change at all. That's the basic trick that they're trying to accomplish. Conservatives do this all the time. Like I mentioned before, it tends to attract people who lack the ability or at least the background to think critically about social systems, to think critically about capitalism, socialism, and therefore go for easy answers about, it's just this conspiracy of this particular group of people, but the system's fine. Never mind the fact that, I can't think about the system with any degree of clarity, therefore I'm just latching on to this easy explanation. I think in many cases, when you actually get down to trying to explain things to these people, conservatives who just do not understand the system as a whole, they're all wrapped up in their microeconomics and this and that just completely excludes, everything that capitalism externalizes. They don't want to look at any of that. They just want to look at this price and free trade and this and that. But they can't actually incorporate the more complex aspects of, all of the ways that their system is roping off entire parts of human life, of organized human existence, as just sort of like somebody else's problem. And they don't want to think about it. And again, I think in many cases, they've never been taught to think about it. It's a lot of work. Many of them are very resistant to it as well. Again, we do what we can. So, continuing on to topic number 6 now. The frequently asserted decadence of the French, which La Difesa attributed to Jewish influence and miscegenation with Africans. Despite the fact that Mussolini had not yet officially entered the European war, the magazine actively attacked the French, who were, however, dismissed as an enemy scarcely worthy of attention. Their supposed failings and weaknesses were described in an article called Greatness and Decadence of the French Race, in issue number 6, which contained a lengthy exposition of French anti-Semitism, as well as in articles entitled France and the Jewish Invasion, issue number 7, The Decadence of the Family in France, issue number 4, and The Half-Caste and France, issue number 10. 3 polemical essays on the Jews in France also appeared in number 9, Hebrew Scandals in Paris, which was illustrated with German anti-Semitic cartoons, How the Jews Became the Masters of France, and The Moral Disorder of France. Attention was also paid to the low French birth rate, which, readers were assured, compared most unfavorably with that of Italy. Emphasis was thus placed, in issue number 8, on the fact that France was a country, quote, where the race declines, a point reiterated in the Decline of a Race, issue number 16. This thesis, which was then central to Italian fascist propaganda, had, as we have seen, been personally expounded by Mussolini, who was again quoted on this matter in issue number 11. His argument was driven home by diagrams purporting to show a numerical decline of the French army, together with photographs of French troops asleep. I guess Italian troops never sleep. Yet another article asked, rhetorically, quote, what military force is the French race capable of? Issue 11. Much space was likewise allocated in issue number 21 to a comparison of demographic trends in Italy and France and the supposed momentous military implications thereof. La Difesa also sought to draw attention to the defects and repressive character of French colonialism in both Africa and Indochina. I laugh, yes, obviously, but again, our fascism is better. One of several articles on this subject bore the dramatic title Agony of the French Empire, issue number 13. Topic number 7. The alleged Jewish domination of Britain. This was asserted in How the Jews Penetrate British Political Life, issue number 7, which featured photographs of such prominent Jewish personalities in Britain as Disraeli and Rothschild. Another piece, entitled The Expansion of Hebrew Influence in England, issue 11, was illustrated with photographs of anti-Semitic leaflets bearing such slogans as boycott the Jewish stalls in your markets and scratch a Bolshevik and find a Jew. The magazine, despite its own commitment to racism, drew a highly unsympathetic picture of the racist character of British colonialism. One article complained that the English hold themselves, quote, superior to all the other peoples of Europe. Oh no. Issue number 2, while another was unambiguously entitled India Oppressed. Issue number 13. Comment, that's the end of topic number 7. You see the United States do this all the fucking time. There is no depth that the hypocrisy can reach which will ever cause them to look at themselves in the mirror. I mean, I'm sure they're aware of it, they just don't care. But when you have Italy, actively waging all kinds of racist propaganda and then pointing a finger at the UK. And again, I'm sure that you had people nodding along in agreement with this, as they read it. Oh, yeah, our fascism is better. Yeah, British colonialism. Wow. I mean, do you not have any decency there, British? So anyway, but this is what happens once you start getting caught up. I think that this kind of danger is present in siding with, one capitalist country against another. It's you got to really restrain yourself in general, because you wind up in a position like this more quickly than you would like. All these countries have these kinds of history, and you can only kind of claim lesser of two evils to a certain extent. All right, continuing to topic number 8, unemployment in the democracies, and by which they mean the capitalist democracies, and their consequent supposed moral inferiority to Fascist Italy and Nazi Germany, in both of which countries labor was more organized by the state. The first theme was propounded in articles entitled Workers in the Democratic, quote, Paradises, and How the Democracies Exploit the Worker. But fascism doesn't. Both articles, in issue number 12, showed unemployment in what the magazine, despite Mussolini's asserted pre-belligerency, openly presented as enemy countries. The second theme was featured in Work We Defend and Give Power to the Race, and The Empire Rendered Fertile by Italian Labor. They were illustrated with photographs of happy-looking Italian men and women busily at work. An article on the organization of work in Germany likewise praised the employment situation in that country. Emphasis was also placed on alleged racial laxity of the, quote, democracies. Contact and Encounters of Races in issue number 5 thus reproduced film clips illustrating the, quote, decadence of the white in far-off countries, whites who do not understand racial differences, and, quote, a race in decadence. Racial problems in the United States were highlighted in North American Racism, issue number 1, which contained a photograph of a Ku Klux Klan gathering, and in The Negro and the Crisis of Civilization, issue number 21. Comment, that's the end of topic number 8. As a quick aside, how was unemployment in Fascist Italy and Nazi Germany? How was the economy generally? Well, in the case of Nazi Germany, they did things like just simply not counting female unemployment. Like women working wasn't considered to be a thing, so if women were unemployed, they just didn't count that. It was largely a war economy. Consumption of almost all consumer goods went down in the Nazi years in Germany. Also, speaking of women's unemployment, Jews, entirely different standards there too. So where unemployment figures could, they made claims that they had improved them, a lot of times they're just counting the white male, quote, Aryan breadwinners, that was the desired group that they wanted to give employment to. Because for Jewish people, areas of the economy and certain jobs became illegal. They became barred from being able to do them. And then they moved, white male Aryan workers into those jobs. And then, boom, we solved unemployment. No, you actually just kind of stopped counting whole groups and you just gave preferential treatment. So anyway, the economy, this was a lot of trickery, not actually improvements in the numbers. Overall, life was not good. Also in Fascist Italy, almost half of the population was employed in agricultural production, and that stayed the same through most of Mussolini's time. The more advanced areas of the economy only developed by a few percentage points. Overall, life was not good. So again, this is another situation of, Italy and Germany trying to compete with the other capitalist powers by really just blatantly hypocritical critiques or accusations. So, what else would you expect, though? Anyway, continuing on to topic 9, identity between Italian fascist and Nazi German racial policies, and the supposed unity of purpose between the regimes in the two countries. These themes were expounded in articles such as The Concept of Race in Germany and Italy in issue 9, and The Scientific and Philosophical Bases of German Racism, issue number 5. Such articles were illustrated by neatly juxtaposed and virtually identical photographs of German and Italian troops, both in modern-style military helmets, and similar pictures of Italian and German male and female ethnic types, issue 14, as well as military personnel and political symbols, the fasces and the swastika, issue number 15. The title page of issue 15 quoted Mussolini as declaring, quote, "In the question of race, we stand firm," unquote, which paralleled Hitler's statement that, quote, "In a Mongolized and Negroified world, we would forever lose beautiful and sublime humanity," unquote. Support for Nazi Germany also led the magazine to voice support for Nazi colonial aspirations in, quote, "German Colonial Claims," issue number 13. Photographs of the forcible arrest of Jews in Germany were also published with evident satisfaction, as well as obvious awareness that such potentially Holocaust action was being taken, issue number 18. Comment, by the way, mentioning the Holocaust there, when I talked about unemployment earlier and the moving of women and Jewish people out of certain areas of work and then claiming that unemployment levels had been improved because they're only counting the white male, quote, Aryan or German workers, that was earlier on. Then as you get later into the 30s, you have slave camps and death camps being set up and an entirely different situation where now you have slave labor holding up the German economy and people being held in these camps, systematically worked to death, and outright murdered by the millions. So there's your success, okay? There's the success of your fascist system. Continuing on to theme number 10, the alleged greater fertility of the Italian and German peoples and their consequent need for geographical expansion in Europe, in addition to colonies in Africa. This thesis, which permeated many articles, was expounded most forcefully in Vital Space for the Fertile Races, issue number 14. Comment, this is of course similar to Hitler's concept of Lebensraum, or living space, that the German way of life needed more space to expand into comfortably. And, here you have the concept that the fertile races, who are just these, workers who can produce such bounty by virtue of their genetic virility, they need more space in which, to live, and therefore these conquests, which are mandated by capitalism, are justified. It's all just different propaganda to, provide, to gin up that consent and to provide these justifications for what capitalism basically mandates. So again, all of this is to avoid socialist revolution and for capitalists to cling to power against all odds. So continuing, next section, the third year, 1939 to 1940. La Difesa's third year, which ran from 5th November 1939 to 20th October 1940, covered the first phase of the European War, as well as Fascist Italy's long-expected entry into it on 10 June, and the French surrender to the Germans less than a fortnight later on 22nd June. At around this time, it was arranged, apparently because of the increasingly critical international situation, that proofs of each issue of the magazine should be showed to the Duce personally prior to publication. These developments in the international field were accompanied by an intensification of the publication's propagandist and militaristic stance. This found expression in several strikingly new cover illustrations. That of number 14, which contained a scarcely veiled allusion to the story of Adam and Eve, depicted a handsome white man being handed an apple by a black damsel, while that of number 16 was based on a photographic collage of an ancient Roman statue with masked Italian fascist soldiers behind it. The June 5 issue was delayed to publish on its title page the triumphant news of Mussolini's declaration of war, which took place 5 days later on the 10th of June. The issues that followed continued to publish the anti-Semitic propaganda and to propound chauvinistic theories of the superiority of the Italian Aryan race, quote-unquote. Arguments were, however, presented in increasingly militaristic terms. Many articles thus attacked the supposedly Jewish-dominated French and British, quote, democracies, while others anticipated fascist and Nazi victories in the European conflict. Admiration, interestingly enough, was also expressed for Mussolini's newly found ally, militaristic but un-Aryan Japan. The magazine's propaganda, directly authorized, it will be recalled, by the Duce, now centered on the following 7 main themes. Theme 1, racism in general, and the supposed need for increased racial consciousness. Some articles on these themes, such as Heredity and Destiny in issue 13, were general and could well have been published in earlier issues. Other pieces were, however, written more specifically in response to the war. Race and the War, issue 4, thus featured Aryan wars of the past, while Supreme Valor of the Aryan Race. This worked out so well for them, is why I'm laughing. Issue number 7, and, quote, The Glory of the Aryan People, issue 15, were intended to suggest the invincibility of the Axis powers. An article on The Doctrine of the Race and the Center of the Political Preparation of Youths, issue 4, discussed the racist education of Italian fascist youth in wartime. Increased relations with fascists in other parts of increasingly war-torn Europe were reflected in several racist articles by fascist supporters abroad. In one such article, The Politics of the Race in Italy and in the World, Ladislaw, oh boy, I'm not going to be able to pronounce that, Tyszkiewicz of the Polish National Monarchical Party, sorry for the pronunciation, went so far as to claim that, quote, the Italo-Abyssinian War was the first war in over 100 years to have been lost by the Hebrews. Issue number 1. The magazine's long-established support of the official fascist policy against conjugal relations between persons of different races reached a new level of intensity in an article entitled Crimes Against the Prestige of the Race, number 4. It publicized the names and portraits of Italians who had produced offspring by men or women of other races. A further critique of, quote, half-castes appeared in issue 10. Quick comment there. Of course, we've all heard, racists in the United States saying things like race traitor and, N-word lover and things like that. That's exactly what they were doing here. Actually trying to publicly shame with their pictures being published and things like that. This is, point being, this is not unique to Italy, and we want to recognize these things and oppose them in our own context as well. Well, it's exactly the same thing. Continuing to theme number 2, the racial inferiority of the Jews and their evils worldwide. Articles on this theme appeared in several issues, including numbers 1 and 5. These featured the supposed Jewish crimes, as supposedly revealed in the so-called Protocols of the Elders of Zion, and in the utterances of the British socialist professor Harold Laski. An article on, quote, the Hebrews of the New Europe, bitterly attacked, quote, the Hebrew seducer of Aryan girls, and the, quote, Hebrew corruption of the theatrical world. Comment there. Of course, we see the same thing, Jews in Hollywood, in the United States, conservatives railing against that. Continuing, topic 3, the racial inferiority of Africans. This was suggested in numerous pictures of very black, and to racist eyes, ugly, i.e. un-European, blacks in Africa, America, France, and elsewhere. The inferiority of Africans was explicitly referred to in an article on Ethiopian art, which was entitled The Decadence of Races and Cultures of the Black Continent, issue 18. Theme 4, the degeneracy of France, a country which was unambiguously referred to in the issue of 5 May 1940, immediately prior to Mussolini's declaration of war, as, quote, enemy France. Several articles, among them those in issues number 9 and 10, challenged the existence of a specifically French race, presented France as Jewish-dominated, and elaborated on French interbreeding with blacks. An article on, quote, French racism in issue 17 claimed that France fell, partly on account of the nefarious activities of Jews and Freemasons, but partly also because of French, quote, racial anarchy, which mixes the blood of the entire world of café latte, i.e. milk coffee, unquote. Mussolini's political claim to Corsica at the same time received support in an article, Italian Corsica, issue 15, which propounded the island's supposedly Italian ethnic character. Comment there. There's a mention of Freemasonry. This is a somewhat unwieldy topic. If anyone has really solid references from a Marxist perspective on this subject, please send them along. I would love to read more about that. There seem to be a lot of contradictory perspectives on this somewhat strange and mysterious topic. And, for example, you have in Nazi Germany and Fascist Italy persecution and suppression of Freemasons, while it's always seemed to me very elitist and right-wing, although also seems to have, played relatively progressive roles in, for example, the struggle for emerging capitalism over the monarchy, although, was that just because Freemasons knew how to keep secrets? Or anyway, there's so many different things going on here. Religious ignorance and hatred of Freemasonry just because it's not Christian enough for them. There's so many different things here. Freemasonry as good old boy network doing business favors for insiders. So many things going on. Again, if anybody has good references from a Marxist perspective, please send them along. Both older references and more recent ones would be very interesting. Thank you. Back to the text. Topic number 5, the decadence of the British and their domination by local and world Jewry. This theme was expounded in several pseudo-historical articles, such as The Jewish British in Egypt, issue number 19, and The Hebrews, the English, and the Opium War, issue 23, and was illustrated by photographs of various prominent Jewish politicians. A photograph of the British Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain bore a somewhat libelous caption stating that he suffered from a, quote, hereditary malady, issue 10. Topic 6, the racial theories of Nazi Germany. These were given sympathetic coverage in several articles, illustrated with propaganda photographs, such as The Study of Hereditary Pathology in Germany, issue 16, German Literature on Race, issue 1, and Racial Propaganda in the Third Reich, issue 17. Italo-German solidarity was likewise suggested in a multi-illustrated article entitled The Italian Woman in German Art, issue 21. Topic 7. The qualities of Asia's own expansionist power, Germany. Its rise to greatness was described in an article on The Japanese Race, issue 7. It claimed that the country was imbued with, quote, unity, not of blood, but above all with spirit, and a high civilization which leads Japan to a great position in world history, and to assume a civilizing role in the Far East. Support for Japan was likewise featured in A Study of Racial Physiology, issue 24. Despite its rabid editorial policy and highly propagandistic character, the magazine received and published a supportive letter from the well-known Swiss traveler and ethnographer Georges Montandon in issue 4, whose earlier scholarship had by then degenerated into racism. The fourth year, 1940 to 1941. La Difesa's fourth volume, which ran from 5 November 1940 to 20 October 1941, appeared at a time when the Axis powers had succeeded in controlling the greater part of Europe. Britain remained unconquered, but the German invasion of Russia had begun on 22 June 1941 and seemed, for the moment at least, irresistible. This politico-military style of affairs in 1940 to 41 was reflected in the increasingly strident pages of the magazine. Its editor, apparently believing an Axis victory inevitable, began to publish articles on the perimeters of a future racist Europe, to be dominated, as he assumed, by Fascist Italy and its allies, all of them Aryans, quote unquote, as he claimed. The publication's venom was now largely directed not only against the Jews, but also at the British, which Interlandi was at pains to depict, unlike the Italians, as belonging to a non-Aryan race. La Difesa, at this stage of its history, couched its propaganda in a European, rather than, as in the past, purely Italian terms. An article in issue number 5 thus claimed that the continent was evolving, quote, from nationalism to racism, and defined the latter for the first time as, quote, totalitarian nationalism. An article on, quote, the politics of race in the new European order, in issue 9, proclaimed that, quote, in the new world, the Aryan people will exercise functions of order and predominance, unquote. That, quote, the new world will be dominated by the ideals of the Aryan race, and that, quote, at the center of the New World Organization will be the great racist empires, i.e. those of Fascist Italy and Nazi Germany. The immense area then under Axis control was emphasized in a map, which represented the greater part of the continent as, quote, Europa ethno-racial. It was dominated by fascist regimes in Italy, Dalmatia, Slovakia, Romania, Hungary, Germany, Holland, and, more recently, the Ukraine, issue 10. The magazine also claimed to envisage a progression, quote, towards a super-racial nationalism, issue 18. La Difesa, as in the past, remained rabidly racist. Its editor, Interlandi himself, in an article bearing Mussolini's slogan, Standing Firm, issue 1, declared, quote, we must return to the origins of Italian racism. Yeah, I think that was Trump's slogan, too. Anyway, another article entitled, quote, Racist Critique of the Democratic Equality, issue 16, was illustrated with a photograph of ordinary Italian workers, contrasted with others of, quote, primitive and semi-naked black men. Beside them was the comment that, quote, uniform physical and mental qualities did not exist in humanity. Other articles drew attention, by contrast, to the disorder and oppression encountered in the, quote, anti-racist democracies, issue 16, a thesis illustrated with photographs featuring British terror in India and racial and other violence in the U.S. Another contributor claimed in number 22 that, quote, as the monkey cannot be confused with man, unquote, so one race cannot be confused with another. An article entitled Maternity as a Defense of the Race, issue 16, likewise developed the often repeated theme that Italian women must preserve the purity of the Italian race. Articles on that subject were, however, now often presented in more militaristic terms than in the past, with photographs of uniformed Italian soldiers, or, as in the case of Heroes of Our Race, issue 24, sculptures of Italian aviators killed in battle. German racial literature in time of war, issue 2, was likewise illustrated by shots of the German army in Poland, while an article on the Hebrews in France after the defeat of 1940, issue 17, contained a cartoon of an ever-mercenary Jew supposedly still trying to do business in a campo di concentramento, or concentration camp, a picture which reveals a clear awareness that such institutions were by then operated by Mussolini's much-admired allies in the Nazi fatherland. Propaganda against racial mixing was meanwhile intensified. An article on The Problem of Half-Castes in Europe, issue 1, declared that, quote, the poison of half-casteism must disappear from the blood of Europe, while another went even further, declaring, quote, half-casteism, quote, a crime against God, issue 8. The magazine continued to condemn the Jews on two main counts, as corrupt merchants, wealthy bankers, and ruthless moneylenders on the one hand, and as bloody revolutionaries and followers of Karl Marx on the other. Comment: you get some of these same contradictory beliefs in today's far-right movement, where Antifa is both effeminate soy boys who are going to, with their degeneracy, undermine Western civilization, and at the same time, uber frightening super soldiers who are going to, overrun your small town militarily with their brute force. It doesn't matter to them. These people don't think rationally. So anyway, continuing. The first of these images was presented in two articles on the, quote, criminality of the Hebrews and the, quote, immoral criminality of the Jews. One article denounced the, quote, Hebrew superstition and ritualism in issue 15, while another quoted a racially minded ecclesiastic, Cardinal Bernetti, as declaring, quote, usury, fraud, disorder, all come from the Hebrews, issue 23. A further piece, entitled Judascope, number 6, contained caricatures of hook-nosed Jews with slogans such as, quote, need to strike against clandestine Hebrews, quote, Jewish merchants, quote, Jews on the stock exchange, and, quote, corrupters of youths and women. Another caricature contained a stereotyped diagram, issue 6, on the supposed, quote, characteristics of the Jew. These were listed as being fat and having curly hair, having hollow protruding ears, fleshy lips, arched noses, and curved shoulders. A second and very different image of the Jews found expression in a cartoon of a Jew in the form of a spider in the center of a web, issue 7. Adjacent articles claimed that Marxism and Semitism were identical, and that there was a natural evolution, quote, from the prophets of Israel to the prophets of the Communist International, unquote. Another cartoon depicted the character of a Jew with the double caption, Jew and Bolshevik, framed in a Star of David, issue 17. The Communist of April 1919 was quoted as declaring, quote, one can say without exaggeration that the Russian Revolution was made by the Jews, unquote, and a speaker at the New York Jewish Institute as observing, quote, Marxism is a modern form of Hebrew prophecy. One article claimed that the Jews were involved in, quote, Hebrew espionage, issue 11, while another asserted that, quote, the Hebrews have provoked 2 world wars and 5 revolutions, the latter in Russia, Germany, Hungary, Spain, and France, issue 20. Comment, you can find the exact same things being said today in the U.S. far right, the exact same things. Continuing. As for the future of the Jews, the magazine bluntly declared that, quote, the armies of the Axis will expel Judaism from Europe, unquote. This theme was illustrated with a photograph of 2 German soldiers forcefully obliging a Jew to move. Hitler was quoted as claiming, quote, all peoples will recognize the greatness of Aryanism and will form a united front of Aryan humanity against the international exploitation of Judaism, unquote. The Führer was further cited as declaring that, quote, the evil influence of Judaism will be terminated forever. The Jews, according to another article in La Difesa, entitled The Future Systematization of the Hebrews, issue 6, were to be forcefully expelled from Europe to Africa, more specifically to what the magazine referred to with a question mark as, quote, Madagascar, the promised land? The deportation of the Jews was advocated, the publication explained, by the French writer Louis Céline, who had frankly spoken of, quote, the need to chase the Jews from our country, issue 14. La Difesa's attack on Britain, which was then regarded by the publication as Fascist Italy's principal enemy, and against which the magazine now often fulminated, was equal only to that of the Jews. One of the fiercest and most bizarre lines of attack was formulated in an article entitled The Two Peoples Elect. It asked, quote, why did not the walls of Jerusalem collapse when the English occupied it? And replied, quote, because the English are Hebrews. Israel controls England, over 100,000 Hebrews in London alone, unquote. Elaborating on this contention, the article argued that, quote, the messianic idea that the domination of the world was, quote, reserved to the English as a people elect, was due less to its reading of the verses of the Bible than to the, quote, Hebrewisation of the British nation. Another article asked rhetorically whether the Rothschild family belonged to the, quote, Anglo-Saxon nobility or to, quote, Anglo-Judaic nobility. Comment, so all of this sounds fucking crazy, but the more that you get caught up in this stuff, I mean, it sounds crazy to us listening to this, the more you get caught up in it, like reason goes out the window and you just start swallowing more and more bullshit to the point that you will just believe anything. And that is how a lot of this crap is perpetuated. Continuing. A further article on this theme, quote, Degeneration of the Anglo-Saxon Race, issue 6, claimed that the Anglo-Saxons had lost all their vitality and, because of their degeneration and exhaustion, merely awaited the hammer blows to which they were daily subjected by the Axis armies. This same theme was expressed in a cartoon of England in the Looking Glass, issue 18. It depicted a handsome young Aryan woman with the Times newspaper on her breast. Looking in the mirror, she appears as a Jewish hag, and the paper reads in reverse, Semit. La Difesa prophesied that, quote, the defeat of England will determine not only the foundation of a new political and economic equilibrium in Europe, but also a racial equilibrium based on hierarchy, unquote, dominated, it was understood, by the Axis powers. Britain was also accused in the magazine of being riddled with Freemasons. La Difesa claimed that there were 1,743 Masonic lodges in Europe, of which no less than 1,305 were in England, and that of 788,853 European Masons, a full 725,000 were English, issue 16. Another line of attack, in issue number 7, was represented in banner lead lines on what the magazine called, quote, English Justice on England. This comprised 3 charges. Quote, the Scots are all thieves, David Hume. Quote, at Oxford one learns only to drink and smoke, Jonathan Swift. And, quote, the English farmers are brigands, The Times, 1830. An article on, quote, psychological atavism of the English race. Imagine printing things like this. Issue 8 likewise declared that a, quote, good Englishman had 3 principles: to make promises and not keep them, to merchandise or speculate in everything, and to rely on the help of others. Really appealing to people's better nature here. Continuing, a further article on the, quote, physical decadence of England, issue 16, was illustrated with cartoons of British rule in Ireland. From the British satirical publication Punch, it was also argued so-called English anti-racism, issue 2, was accompanied by cruel repression, both in India and Ireland, and that the Anglo-Boer War, in which the British had made use of concentration camps, had been accompanied by, quote, Anglo-Judaic vandalism. The Difesa's attack on the British extended as far as Australia. Publicity was thus given to what the magazine called, quote, the little edifying story of the ancestors of the Anzacs, i.e. Australian troops, issue 13. Referring to the country's early settlement by convicts, the magazine claimed that the Australian was, quote, the only people in the world who could not speak of their forebears without blushing, unquote. La Difesa, not surprisingly, on account of its Anglophobia and military chauvinism, gave enthusiastic prominence to the Italian capture of British Somaliland, which it triumphantly referred to in its issue of 20 January 1941 as, quote, Somalia ex Britannica. The subsequent collapse, only a few months later, of the whole Italian army in East Africa was, however, completely ignored by the magazine. Details. France, having by now fallen and come under a pro-fascist government, received little further attention from La Difesa. An article on the French Revolution, nevertheless, argued that this event represented a, quote, principle of regression. The magazine contended that, quote, the civilization of Europe was violently struck by the revolution, which it claimed had been characterized by, quote, terror and, quote, ferocity. Publicity was also given to a photograph in France of a black boy and a white girl bathing together. This was captioned, quote, scandalous promiscuity of white and black children in a French college. Though the United States at this time had not yet entered the war, La Difesa seems to have reckoned that this could not be long deferred, and therefore extended its polemical attacks to that country. It was denounced as both Jewish-dominated, as suggested by an article on The Hebrews of America, and racially decadent. An article on Whites and Blacks in America, issue 2, claimed that the racial situation in the country was symbolized by a photograph of two individuals, in which the Negro stood above the white. An article on, quote, North American Perversions, issue 11, gave prominence to a performance of Shakespeare, which the magazine considered particularly shocking, as it was acted by black actors, and was therefore, as the publication saw it, a, quote, counterfeit production. Commenting again, you can find stuff exactly like this still in far-right stuff in the U.S. And again, the hypocrisy of, Italy, which I was laughing about before, saying this about other imperialist powers. It's like that irony and hypocrisy is lost on these people. It's really up to us to point it out. All right, continuing. Another article entitled The Racial Conflict Between Japan and the USA in issue 10 described the former as a racially homogeneous and hence a strong country, whereas the latter was depicted by a caricature of Uncle Sam with photographs of Jewish immigrants pouring into his country. Another cartoon depicted greedy America, issue 22, devouring a cake, while the rest of the world starved, and an ancient warrior with the Star of David and a Jewish menorah watched. The magazine's comment read, quote, the real ends of the Jewish plutocracy are not those enunciated by Roosevelt and Churchill, but to enlarge the conflict and condemn the rest of the world to hunger, unquote. Support for Japan was also expressed in articles on the, quote, Japanese race, issue 1, and its prehistory by the now notorious Swiss scholar Georges Montandon, issue 4. With the opening of German invasion of the Soviet Union, in which Fascist Italy participated if only symbolically, La Difesa devoted numerous articles to that country, which, like all other enemies, was presented as racially divided and a pawn of world Jewry. Attention was thus focused on the minority peoples of the Soviet Union, both in Europe and Asia, and to what the magazine denounced as the country's, quote, Jewish diplomacy, issue 19. A series of accompanying articles highlighted what was presented as a Jewish conspiracy in Russia, as evinced by the existence of prominent Jewish Bolsheviks from Trotsky to Litvinov, and the names of dozens of prominent Jews in Russian civilian and military service. Attention was likewise given, with indignation, to the fact that the wives of both Stalin and Molotov were Jewish. The fifth year, 1941 to 1942. La Difesa's fifth year, which ran from 5 November 1941 to 20 October 1942, witnessed Fascist Italy's declaration of war on the United States of America on 10 December 1941, and the Battle of Stalingrad in August 1942. These military events were accompanied by an acutely deteriorating economic situation in Italy, as a result of which the publication shrunk to only 24 pages. The magazine's propaganda at this time continued to be closely influenced by the unfolding military struggle. Articles on the supposedly, quote, scientific importance of race and the supposed, quote, inferiority of Jews, Africans, and, quote, half-castes still appeared as a matter of routine. Increased attention was, however, paid to the, quote, decadence and other alleged bad qualities of Fascist Italy's three main enemies, the Soviet Union, Great Britain, and, after the beginning of 1941, the United States, where the Italo-Jewish mayor of New York, Italo-Jewish in quotes, Fiorello LaGuardia, was singled out for special vituperation. Praise was, at the same time, lavished on the regime's principal ally, Nazi Germany, and to some extent also Japan. La Difesa proclaimed, as in the past, the overwhelming importance of race and its supposedly, quote, scientific character. This was reflected in such articles as The Scientific Genesis of the Concept of Race in issue 15 and Biology and Race in issue 9. The latter article, which was illustrated with photographs of healthy Italian youngsters, claimed that, quote, race is a biological entity that has its foundation in blood and flesh and muscles and nerves and all the cells of the human organism, unquote. This argument was repeated in many other articles, among them two entitled, quote, The Concept of Race is Purely Biological, issue 12, and Biological Realities of the Race, issue 13. Other articles included Foundations of Racial Hygiene, issue 15, Racism and Imperial Expansion, issue 21, and Consciousness of Blood, issue 20. Another article highlighted the supposed superstitions of the African peoples, issue 10, while another on, quote, the Italian race which builds, issue 23, proclaimed, quote, the need to conduct an implacable fight against half-castes who seek to disturb the serene work of the real Italian people, unquote. Mussolini, Italy's self-proclaimed duce, was seen in a photograph, quote, among the sons of his people, while an article on the racial Italianity of Nice supported his claim to that French town. A piece on the, quote, defense of the race in Germany likewise carried enthusiastic photos of Hitler Youth at work and on parade. Other racist articles bore such titles as The Pure Italian Race in issue 13, Continuity of the Italian Race, issue 17, The Aryanity of Italy, number 12, Aryan Italy, number 17, and The Aryan Nobility of the Italians, number 15. The magazine, reverting to one of its old racist theses, claimed that there, quote, a pure Italian race existed, but that, quote, the Hebrews did not belong to the Italian race, issue 17. The supposed paramountcy of the Aryan race was likewise expounded in Evolution of the Concept of Aryanism, issue 15. The assumed superiority of the Italian and Aryan race was even more explicitly propounded in an article headed Inferiors and Superiors, issue 1, which contrasted, quote, primitive African masks with the finest of Roman statues. A similar racist approach was developed in Gravity of the Hebrew Problem in Italy, issue 13, which was illustrated with a photograph of Polish Jews constructing a wall around their ghetto. The picture's caption bore the significant comment that, quote, material separation does not yet constitute the complete solution of the Hebrew problem. It is, however, the first measure which must be adopted for the safeguard of the Aryan race, unquote. Comment: the Aryan race sounds pretty fragile for such a superior creation. Continuing, photographs of Jews obliged to wear Stars of David stitched on their clothing in German-occupied Europe were also published, with editorial approval, in numbers 8 and 24. Interlandi and his associates wrote enthusiastically of the deportation of the Jews. A special issue, number 16, was devoted to the, quote, work of the Hebrews, a euphemism for forced labor. The editorial observed, quote, the Italian racial laws and the state of war have led to this unforeseen result. Jews of all conditions, from the most humble to the most qualified, at last appreciate the joys of manual work, unquote. Comment there. So what I said before about co-opting radical rhetoric and energy towards the status quo, this is exactly a kind of parody and mockery of the socialist idea of capitalists working, not being parasites. But here they have racialized it, taken out the class component, and twisted it into something totally monstrous. Whereas socialists are working for a world of peace in which there are not class contradictions which create huge misery and inequality, the fascists are working exactly for that unequal society and scapegoating Jews while twisting the words of socialists into this racialized mess. Continuing. Emphasizing that the, quote, Hebrews of Italy were by then, quote, classified by law as second-class citizens and, quote, denied the privilege of carrying arms. The article claimed that prior to the war, they had forgotten that though Italy was, quote, a land of equality, it was also one of severe justice, unquote. Though previously living on the work of others, they were now for the first time obliged for others, quote, incredible to say, for the hated Goy, i.e. Gentile, unquote. An article in the same issue entitled The Eternal Triumph of Rome Over Parasitic Judaism was accompanied by photographs of Jews working in labor camps, which clearly met with the magazine's approval. La Difesa's attack on the United States reached its maximum intensity in the immediate aftermath of Mussolini's declaration of war on that country. The issue for 5 December 1941, which was evidently prepared with advanced knowledge of this event, carried an article in issue 3 with the heading, American Intervention Signifies America is Anti-Aryan. The following issue declared that, quote, between the Negro and the Jew, America's plutocrats were speculating at the expense of the ordinary people, unquote. This theme was illustrated with a photograph of Mayor LaGuardia gobbling a hamburger in public. This was described as a, quote, spectacle of vulgarity, fitting a country in which, quote, blacks and whites fraternally mixed. I mean, commenting maybe they had not heard of segregation, this was still quite a thing, just not in that part of the United States. Never enough, though. It's never enough. Another article entitled Civilization and Race featured a picture of young blacks dancing, with the comment that they, quote, probably spoke a perfect Yankee, but were Negroes, and nothing could annul their congenital inferiority, unquote. Comment, I think it's about time Fascist Italy gets a little more credit for their racism. Germany's really hogging all the credit there. Continuing. Another issue on the United States, number 7, contained a series of articles with such titles as How the Jews Have Dragged the United States into War, The Laughter of Roosevelt and the Jew LaGuardia Threatened to Ruin for the American People. To underline this prophecy, the magazine published pictures of massed gravestones. Other articles sought to discredit the United States on almost every conceivable count. They bore such titles as United States, the Anglo-Saxon Racial Myth, Physio-Psychological Characteristics of the Anglo-Saxons in America, Social Disorders, The Unemployed, The Horrors of American Prisons, 1.5 million crimes per year, Political Gangsterism, The Omnipotence of the Gangster is Acquiesced by the Policeman, Political Corruption, and Jewocracy, The Hebrews in the USA. These articles were illustrated with photographs of unemployed workers, urban wastelands, hunger marches, and groups of strikers being broken up by the police, as well as gangsters and gang violence. One picture showed blacks, and others with posters such as Negro and White Unite and Fight. Another depicted a group of women with the placard, No More Babies Until Better Housing. Publicity was also given to the American invention of a, quote, kissing machine, and to a report that, quote, a 9-year-old girl has married a man of 21, unquote. And comment to this, if you ran similar things today, of course similar things are being run today, how many people are going to chime in with, well, they got a point about blah, blah, blah. At what point are people just going to be able to uniformly recognize this stuff for the hypocritical garbage that it is? Fascism isn't going to lead to a better world. Libertarianism isn't going to lead to a better world. Even if they have half a point about this or that once in a while, their solutions are worse than the problem currently is. Anyway, it's just watching history repeat generation after generation. It really gets old. Continuing, such subjects, often illustrated pictorially, were expounded ad nauseum in later issues. A cartoon of America and Stalin in bed together carried the question of whether this was a, quote, marriage of convenience or affinity of blood, unquote. Number 8. An article on the, quote, racial history of the United States, slavery, and Anglo-Saxon humanity, unquote, expounded on the evils of racial promiscuity. Pictures of blacks and Jews in the United States were accompanied by the question, are Anglo-Saxons North Americans? And the reply that America was characterized by, quote, an extreme racial diversity. Photographs of the American First Lady, Eleanor Roosevelt, in various poses, bore a caption denouncing her as, quote, the incarnation of the most odious perversion of femininity. Another photograph was of an American black, Olivia Strong, who is alleged to have given birth as a result of, quote, events on which it was prudent not to investigate, to twins, one entirely white and the other black. Issue 24. Oh, the humanity. These are the fixations of fascists. What's the point? Is this really should be our focus in life? These kinds of concerns, racial purity. The fuck cares? Continuing. The magazine's attack on the British, which had reached a peak of intensity in the summer of 1940, now also grew even more bitter. King George VI was denounced in one article as the King of the Jews and of Semitic origin, while Prime Minister Winston Churchill was indicted as a, quote, agent of Judaism. The country itself was deprecatingly referred to as, quote, Masonic and anti-Catholic England, and accused of being party to an Anglo-Judaic alliance. An article on Israel in England was illustrated by a photograph of Churchill superimposed on that of a Jew. Criticism was likewise directed against British, quote, imperialism in India, as well as against, quote, Judaic power in the Union of South Africa and the, quote, racial decadence of English South Africa. The magazine's attack on the Soviet Union coincided with some of the fiercest fighting with that country. Comment, almost like this whole thing is entirely self-serving for the purpose of manipulating their population reading it. Note to racists, you're being manipulated. Okay. Issue number 14 for 20 May 1940 opened with a drawing of a procession in which a band of blacks and Asiatics carried a banner with the slogan, Workers of the World Unite. Bolshevism was then denounced in a series of articles. One, entitled The Essence of Bolshevism, proclaimed that it was the, quote, negation of God, the state, morality, and civilization. Another declared, quote, the enemy of God and civilization. Bolshevism protects the blacks, to whose level it wants to lower the world, unquote. Other articles, including one on Bolshevism and civilization, sought to contrast the Bolshevism of Soviet Russia with the decency of Fascist Italy. This was illustrated by photographs of Italian health and wealth juxtaposed with ones of Russian poverty and disease, with contrasting slogans such as Italian women, strong and kind, versus Bolshevism lowers the mother, degrades woman. Or, quote, the family founded by the fascist state versus Bolshevism dissolves family ties. Or, quote, workers in Italy and Germany are the true aristocracy of the race versus, quote, Bolshevism preaches confusion to the workers and the degradation of the race. Or, the Bolshevik hordes fight for barbarism while the armies of the Axis fight for Europe. Or, fascism exalts the individual and tempers collectivity, while, quote, Bolshevism negates the individual and annihilates the mass. Cue Jordan Peterson crying about the death of the individual in his Kermit voice. Other articles continued to feature alleged Jewish predominance in the Soviet Union. A photograph of the Jew Radek and other high-level Jewish Bolsheviks at a state banquet bore a caption declaring that, quote, millions of poor Russian peasants are snuffed out by the million, but the bigwigs of Bolshevism never lack anything. To emphasize this contrast, a photograph entitled The Soviet Paradise featured 9 people sharing 2 beds. France and Japan at this time attracted only limited attention in the magazine. The former, having long since surrendered, was largely ignored. The country was, however, referred to in one issue as, quote, negritized while another highlighted its allegedly excessive Jewish population. Those were issues 18 and 19. Occasional favorable articles on, quote, the Japanese race nevertheless appeared in issues 22 through 24. The sixth and final year, 1942 to 43. La Difesa's sixth and last year, which ran from 5 November 1942 to 20 April 1943, witnessed the Battle of El Alamein in late October, early November 1942, a decisive British victory, which set the stage half a year later for the Allied landing in Sicily in July 1943 and the ensuing collapse of fascism throughout Italy. In this military situation, the struggle against the British came increasingly to dominate the pages of La Difesa. Though continuing its general racist propaganda against Jews and, quote, half-castes, the magazine now devoted the greater part of its polemical writings to attacks on the British. La Difesa's continued emphasis on racism was formulated in an article, Biological and Scientific Racism, in issue 1. Illustrated by a bizarre photograph of a gorilla having its hair cut, a headline asked, "Can one change one's race?" To which it replied, "No, the hairdresser's care will leave the monkey as it was before. In the same way, a Hebrew can never become an Aryan," unquote. Supposed Aryan superiority was affirmed in numerous articles, among them the instinct of superiority in Aryan blood, and does there exist a hierarchy in the human race? To which the periodical answered in the affirmative, with a picture of a handsome young Italian youth in juxtaposition to a naked and moronic-looking African child, issue number 12. The claim that Italians belonged to the Aryan race was once more formulated in an article significantly entitled Italic Ethnicity, Aryan Blood, issue 6. An article on the, quote, anti-Aryan role of the historic half-caste, issue 2, claimed that, quote, in half-casteism lies the fundamental cause of the decadence and the crises of the great empires of history, unquote. Comment, so there's your counter to Marxism. Forget historical materialism. You want to look at half-casteism. Okay. From this thesis, the magazine concluded, quote, it is necessary to establish the basis of a decisively Aryan solution for our future existence, unquote. Praise was likewise devoted to the fascist and Nazi youth organizations, the Balia and Hitlerjugend, which were enthusiastically described as, quote, sprouts of two races destined to give a new order to the world, unquote. Still waiting on that one. Another article, entitled The United Front of Italian Racism, issue 8, proclaimed that Italian racists, quote, must believe in the millenary quality of the Italian people, and added, quote, it is necessary at this time for the racist to convince the Italian people that international Jewry, with all its ramifications, is Italy's #1 enemy, unquote. A similar theme was taken up in the magazine's last issue, number 12, in an article on the, quote, present and future of Italian racism. It claimed that, quote, Italian racism will continue to be real even after the war. The seat of the Hebrews must be far from our Mediterranean, unquote. As for Fascist Italy's other wartime enemies, one issue of La Difesa carried an article on, quote, the racial chaos in the United States, issue 8, while another, on the Slavs, asserted that they consisted of various groups, some of race, others of mixed language, and diverse races, issue 3. The magazine's main polemical thrust at this time was, however, against the English, and was still largely based on supposed Jewish influence in the country. The publication attempted to document this in an article entitled Hebrewism in British Politics and Diplomacy, issue 1, which listed numerous Jews in British public service. La Difesa, however, went much further, for it also sought to prove that the British were degenerate, quite independently of the Jews, for they belonged, like the latter, to an inferior race. Considerable publicity was thus given to an article on the, quote, racial inferiority of the Anglo-Saxons by Aldo Modica, which ran through no fewer than 5 issues, numbers 4, 5, 6, 8, and 10. This alleged inferiority, or decadence, was illustrated by photographs of English gentlemen in bowler hats and pinstripe trousers, and judges wearing old-fashioned wigs. A cartoon depicted an Englishman so dressed, reportedly, quote, diseducated at Eton and Oxford, sitting arrogantly on a kneeling Indian. The caption claimed that he had in this manner succeeded in dominating the entire Indian subcontinent. An article entitled "The Anglo-Saxon Race Against Europe" included a photograph of the then Archbishop of Canterbury, William Temple, with the comment, by way of insult, that he looked like a rabbi. The magazine sought at the same time to portray Britain as a poverty-stricken country inhabited largely by delinquents. One of several photographs of underprivileged Britons bore the caption, quote, "While the plutocrats fatten themselves, the people in London starve." An entire issue, number 7, was devoted to, quote, "the horrors of slave-ridden England." It was illustrated with drawings of the 18th century slave boats used by the British to carry Negro slaves to the New World. One set of banner headlines read, quote, "Fires, Massacres, Violence, the Heritage of English Domination in Africa," while another declared, quote, "How the English Punish Rebels, Amputation of a Leg and the Stake, or Death from Famine, in some cases castration." It was also asserted in bold letters that, quote, "In the English Empire, slavery still exists." Comment, again, just the shameless hypocrisy. Shameless hypocrisy. This is, I think, modern day libertarians who I think are absolutely crypto-fascists. People are sometimes disarmed. It's a bit shocking, to be honest, the level of hypocrisy, where they just turn a blind eye completely to, their own system, their own ideology. This is like really par for the course with that. This is totally in line with that. Anyway, continuing. Another issue, number 9, was devoted to the, quote, "immorality of the English race." This was encapsulated in a cartoon depicting a scene of desolation, with a beggar, a wolf, and a vulture. One of them declares, "It is useless. Where the English have passed, there is no longer anything left." A further cartoon, entitled "No Remorse for the Transvaal," depicted Queen Victoria in a bath exclaiming, "God be praised, I can still give myself a good bath of Christian blood." The same issue described the British as, quote, "delinquents by birth," and under the headline, "Documents of Infamy," reproduced early 19th century statistics of the number of persons arrested by the London police and cases of drunkenness in the decade between 1838 and 1848. It's like a century prior. Okay. The British were likewise condemned as constituting, quote, "the most hypocritical nation in the world." Okay. And the New York Sun of 1903 was quoted as declaring, quote, "When England and the English people accuse someone of a crime which they themselves have committed, it is necessary to ring the alarm bell. Above all, when they speak of morality, it means that they have some annexation in view," unquote. Other articles on Britain bore such self-explanatory titles as, quote, "The English Described by Dickens," quote, "English Arrogance," "Scandals and Prostitution," and "The Englishman is the most syphilitic in the world." Hard-hitting journalism there. Yet another issue, number 11, devoted to the, quote, "uncivilized England," carried articles called, quote, "British Barbarity and the New European Consciousness," quote, "The Slums of England," quote, "Tragedies of English Infancy, the Slaughter of the Innocents," "Pauperism," "Social Injustice," "Female Degradation," "The Country of No Education," "Medieval Legislation," and "One Drunkard in Every 10 Englishmen." The following issue of La Difesa, scheduled for 5 May 1943, was advertised as devoted to a subject dear to the editor's heart, the Judification of England, but the magazine ceased publication before it could appear. Conclusion. The story of La Difesa della Razza, a periodical sponsored by the Italian Fascist Party, and one in which the Duce took a keen personal interest, and in large measure reflected his views, serves to focus attention on the history of Fascist Italy's acceptance of racism. This phenomenon was of no small importance in the evolution of both Italian fascism and Italian colonialism, and hence of the Ethiopian history of the fascist occupation period. Though the roots of colonial racism date back to the beginnings of the Italian colony of Eritrea, fascism in its initial phase took virtually no interest in race. The subsequent development of a fascist, racist ideology was a direct result of Mussolini's invasion of Ethiopia. This led, on the one hand, to a belief that the fascist empire should be based on a hierarchy in which pride of place should go to the conquerors, and on the other hand, to a fear that the empire might be subverted by intermarriage and other contacts between Italians and colonial subjects. Such racist concerns were duly reinforced by Mussolini's increasingly all-important alliance with Nazi Germany, as well as by the Duce's growing personal admiration for its Führer, Adolf Hitler. Such was the genesis of La Difesa della Razza, which sought to define the theoretical perspectives of Italian racism and to popularize, and in a sense to legitimize, them among the Italian public, both fascist and non-fascist. These perspectives were of direct relevance to Italian-occupied Ethiopia in that they insisted on the inferiority of the, quote, native population, advocated the strictest racial segregation, and sought to denigrate, indeed almost to demonize, the offspring of any form of interracial unions. This had far-reaching implications for the fascist empire in that it led to urban segregation, separate transport for the two races, and markedly inferior facilities for natives in the field of education and public health. The magazine, which gave slavish support to fascist colonial ambitions, however, also attempted to serve the fascist regime by attempting to popularize other aspects of Italian foreign policy. An ongoing propaganda campaign against Africans and Jews was thus accompanied by polemics against other enemies of the day, most noticeably the French, the Anglo-Saxons, and the Slavs, as well as the democracies, or plutocracies as the periodical chose to regard them, and the Bolsheviks. All were denounced as either dominated and manipulated by the Jews or corrupted by miscegenation with Africans, or both. La Difesa, though consistent in its racism, which was embodied in its title, thus also reflected changes in fascist thinking and in fascist Italy's military situation, which took place during the short but historically fast-developing half-decade or so of its existence. Though the magazine was influential in terms of its backing, we will probably never be able to establish how far it actually influenced Italian thinking at the governmental or popular level. Perusal of its pages is nevertheless interesting as a barometer of fascist thinking in the short era of its publication. Born as a direct result of Italy's Ethiopian War, La Difesa became increasingly militaristic as a result of Mussolini's entry in the European War, only to perish, like him, in the course of that historic conflagration. And that is the end of the audiobook. Quick comment to Marxist Internet Archive. There's like a ton of typos in this one. It was kind of hard to read in places, and I had to skip certain sentences and kind of invent conclusions or, transitions in other sentences just to have it make some kind of sense. And I think a few of these that I read didn't quite make sense. My apologies. That said, it's over 99% good and clear. So anyway, I think that was a very interesting piece here in our fascism series on the channel. What can we say about race? I guess in closing, I'd just like to say a few words. Race is a social construct. Contradicting the fascist assertions of the biological basis of race, no, there are none. Race is basically a set of very superficial differences in human appearance that are basically the result of geographic isolation over thousands of years. I mean, for most of human history, we have not had really good, fast, reliable transportation. Nothing like we've seen in the last 50 or even 100 or, even 200 years. But I mean, in the last, 50, 75 years in particular, world travel has been just easier than, ever before. It's just not even close. So we're seeing more people moving from one part of the world to another, you know, and probably some of these differences will significantly erode over time, particularly if transportation technology is, you know, maintained at its current level or greater. People will continue to form relationships and reproduce with people who don't share their genetic background. And, you know, race as we know it will change considerably. It's nothing to be upset about. It's really, like I said, superficial differences in, you know, really just surface level aspects of human biology. Humans have assigned a great deal of importance to this because, in large part, we didn't know any better. We can confirm now through genetics that there's not much to race, that we are, all of us, all humans are far more similar than we are different. And I don't know. I mean, I feel like to this audience, probably most of this doesn't need to be said, but race is not really a natural fact. It is a social construction. We still have to deal with it as a political phenomenon because people continue to treat it as real. And, you know, there are Marxist ways of approaching the, you know, how to respect a particular like national identity within a socialist project, etc. There's ways to do this peacefully, but really, long term, we do not need race. It's a concept that just really does nothing for humanity, and the sooner that we can move beyond it, really the better. And you see, it's these irrational romanticizations of concepts like race, which are basically illusions that reactionaries latch onto, and it becomes a basis for, you know, ramping up hysteria and fear campaigns that really just lead to manipulation of the working class for the interests of capitalists. So I'll leave it at that. Thanks for listening. Thanks to the current patrons whose names are on the screen. If you'd like to get your name on the screen or just support the program, you can head to patreon.com/socialismforall. You can sign up for as little as $2 a month or more. If you can't do that, liking, sharing, subscribing, and commenting always helps. If you're on Facebook, if you want to share the videos into some of the left-wing Facebook groups, those tend to be good audiences. Otherwise, thanks again for listening, and we will see you in the next one.